The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's experiences during one of America's most turbulent times. Written with honesty and vivid detail, Stillwell takes readers through his journey from enlistment as a young farm boy to the brutal realities of battle, camp life, and survival in the Civil War. Unlike the stories of famous generals, this memoir gives a rare glimpse into the daily struggles, camaraderie, and emotional toll of a common soldier. Told from a personal and reflective perspective, it's an invaluable piece of history that immerses readers in the grit and courage of those who fought on the front lines. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. Sometime during the last of February, the welcome news was given out from regimental headquarters that we were soon to leave Camp Carrollton. Our first objective point was to be St. Louis, Missouri, and what next, nobody knew. Definite orders for the movement were issued later, and it then occurred to us that possibly all our recent apprehensions about not seeing any fighting were somewhat premature. Right here, I will say that in the brief sketch of the regiment published in the reports of the Adjutant General of the state of Illinois, the date of our leaving Carrollton is given as February 21st, which is wrong. That date is either a mistake of the person who wrote that part of the sketch or a typographical error. I have in my possession, and now lying before me, a letter I wrote to my father from Benton Barracks, dated March 2, 1862, in which the date of our arrival at St. Louis is given as February 28th. And I well know that we were only 2 days on the trip. Besides the date given in my letter, I distinctly remember several unwritten facts and circumstances that satisfy me beyond any doubt that the day we left Carrollton was February 27, 1862. Early in the morning of that day, the regiment filed out at the big gate and marched south on the dirt road. Goodbye to old Camp Carrollton. Many of the boys never saw it again, and I have seen it only once since, in the summer of 1894. I was back then in Jersey County on a sort of visit and was taken with the desire to run up to Carrollton and look at the old camp. There was then a railroad, constructed during the last years of the war, or about that time, running south from the town, and less than an hour's ride from Jerseyville, where I was stopping. So, I got on a morning train and, like Jonah when moved to go to Tarshish, paid the fare and went. I found the old camp still being used as a county fairground, and the same big trees, or most of them, were still there and looked about as they did 32 years before. Of course, every vestige of our old barracks was gone. I stood around, looked at things for a while, thought, and then left. I have never been there again. The regiment arrived at Jerseyville about sunset. The word had gone out, all through the country, that Fry's regiment was leaving for the front, and the country people had come to town from miles around in their farm wagons to have one last look and bid us goodbye. The regiment, in column by companies, company distance apart, marched up the main street running south, and upon reaching the center of the little town, we wheeled into line, dressed on the colors, and stood at attention. The sidewalks were thronged with country people, all intently scanning the lines, each little family group anxiously looking for their boy, brother, husband, or father, as the case may have been. But right here, it will be said that the overwhelming majority of the enlisted men of the regiment, and most of the line officers, were unmarried. I was certain that my parents were somewhere among the crowd of spectators, for I had specifically written them about when we would pass through Jerseyville. I was in the front rank and kept my face rigidly fixed to the front but glanced as best I could up and down the sidewalk, trying to locate my father and mother. Suddenly, I saw them as they struggled to the edge of the walk, not more than 10 feet from me. I had somewhat dreaded the meeting and the parting that was to come. I remembered the emotion of my mother when she first saw me in my uniform, and I feared that now she might break down altogether. But there she stood, her eyes fixed on me intently, with a proud and happy smile on her face. You see, we were a magnificent-looking body of young fellows, somewhere between 800 and 900 strong. Our uniforms were clean and relatively new, and our faces were ruddy and glowing with health. Besides the regimental colors, each company at that time carried a small flag, all fluttering in the breeze, and our regimental band was playing patriotic tunes at its best. I reckon it was a somewhat inspiring sight to country people like those who, with possibly very few exceptions, had never seen anything like that before. Anyhow, my mother was evidently content and glad to see me there, under the shadow of the flag, going forth to fight for the old Union, instead of sneaking around at home like some great hulking boys in our neighborhood who were of Copperhead sympathies and parentage. Arrangements had been made to quarter the regiment that night in different public buildings in the town, and the companies were soon marched to their respective places. Company D had been assigned to the Baptist church, and there my parents and I met and had our final interview. They were 9 miles from home, in the old farm wagon. The roads, in the main, led through dense woods and across ridges and hollows. The short winter day was drawing to a close, and night was approaching, so our farewell talk was necessarily brief. Our parting was simple and unaffected, without any display of emotion by anybody. But my mother's eyes looked unusually bright, and she did not linger after she had said, "Goodbye, Leander." As for my father, he was an old North Carolinian, born and raised among the Cherokee Indians at the base of the Great Smoky Mountains. With him, and all other men of his type, any yielding to womanish feelings was looked on as almost disgraceful. His farewell words were few and concise, spoken in his usual tone and manner. He then turned on his heel and was gone. My mother left me a baked chicken, a big, fat hen full of stuffing, rich in sage and onions, also some mince pie, old-time donuts, and cucumber pickles. I shared it all with Bill Banfield, my chum, and we had plenty for supper and breakfast the next day, with the drumsticks and some other outlying portions of the chicken for dinner. Early the next morning, we pulled out for Alton, on the Mississippi River. But we did not have to march much that day. The country people around and near Jerseyville turned out in force with their farm wagons and insisted on hauling us to Alton, and their invitations were accepted with pleasure. A few miles north of Alton, we passed what was in those days, and maybe yet, a popular and celebrated school for girls called the Monticello Female Seminary. The girls had heard of our coming and were all out by the side of the road, 100 or more, with red, white, and blue ribbons in their hair and on their clothing. They waved white handkerchiefs and little flags at us and looked their sweetest. And didn't we cheer them? Well, I should say so. We stood up in the wagons, swung our caps, and just whooped and hurrahed as long as those girls were in sight. We always treasured this incident as a bright, precious link in the chain of memory, for it was the last public manifestation of goodwill and patriotism from girls and women that was given to the regiment until we struck the soil of the state of Indiana on our return home, some months after the close of the war. We arrived at Alton about sundown and at once marched aboard the big sidewheel steamboat, City of Alton, which was lying at the wharf waiting for us. Guards were promptly stationed to prevent the men from leaving the boat. But someone had blundered, and no rations had been provided for our supper. We were good and hungry, too, for our dinner, at least that of Company D, had consisted only of the leftover scraps from breakfast. The officers quickly got to work, went uptown, and bought something for us to eat with their own money. My company was furnished a barrel of oyster crackers, called in those days butter crackers, and our drink was river water. The novelty and excitement of the last 2 days had left me nerveless and tired out, and, to tell the truth, I was feeling the first touch of homesickness. So, after supper, I went up on the hurricane deck of the boat, spread my blanket on the floor, and, with my knapsack for a pillow, lay down and soon fell asleep. The boat did not leave Alton until after dark. When it pulled out, the scream of the whistle, the dashing of the paddles, and the throbbing and crash of the engines aroused me from my slumber. I sat up, looked around, and watched the lights of Alton twinkling and glimmering in the darkness until they were lost from sight by a bend in the river. Then, I lay down and went to sleep again and did not wake until daylight the next morning. When I awoke, I found that our boat was moored at the wharf in St. Louis. We soon debarked and marched out to Benton Barracks, which was clear out of town and beyond the suburbs. As I now remember, Benton Barracks was shaped like a big oblong square. The barracks themselves consisted of a continuous connected row of low frame buildings, with the quarters of each company separated from the others by frame partitions. Each was provided with 2 rows of bunks around the sides and ends. At the rear of the quarters of each company was the company kitchen. It was a detached, separate frame structure, amply provided with accommodations for cooking, including a brick furnace with openings for camp kettles, pots, boilers, and the like. Both barracks and kitchen were comfortable and convenient, and they were greatly superior to our homemade shacks at Carrollton. The barracks enclosed a good-sized tract of land, but its exact extent I do not now remember. This space was used for drilling and parades, and it was almost entirely devoid of trees. The commander of the post at that time was Colonel Benjamin L. E. Bonneville, an old regular Army officer who had been a noted Western explorer in his younger days. I frequently saw him riding about the grounds. He was a little dried-up old Frenchman and had no military look about him whatsoever. All the same, he was a man who had, as a soldier, done long and faithful service for his adopted country. Should you ever want to learn more about him, if you have not already done so, read Adventures of Captain Bonneville, USA, in the Rocky Mountains in the Far West, by Washington Irving. You will find it deeply interesting. We remained at Benton Barracks for about 4 weeks. Life there was monotonous and devoid of any special interest. We drilled very little, as I now remember, because it rained most of the time we were there, and the drill grounds became oceans of mud. The drainage was wretched, and most of the rain that fell stayed on the surface until the ground soaked it up. And how it did rain at Benton Barracks in March 1862. While there, I found an old, tattered, paper-bound copy of Dickens' Bleak House in some recently vacated quarters. On those rainy days, I would climb up in my upper bunk, lie there, and read that book. Some of the aristocratic characters mentioned in it had a country residence called Chesneywold, where it seemed to always be raining. To quote, in substance, from the book, the rain was ever falling, drip, 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 by day and night, at the place in Lincolnshire. It was even so at Benton Barracks. When weary of reading, I would turn and look out the little window beside my bunk that gave a view of most of the square the barracks enclosed. The surface of the earth was just a quagmire of mud and water. Nothing was stirring abroad, except for the occasional mounted orderly splashing across the grounds at a gallop. Since then, I have frequently reread Bleak House, and whenever I come across the chapter depicting the rainy weather at the Dedlock estate, I can again see, smell, hear, and feel those gloomy, wearisome conditions at Benton Barracks more than half a century ago. I have read somewhere in General Sherman's memoirs a statement in substance that rain in camp has a depressing effect upon soldiers but is enlivening to them on a march. From personal experience, I know that observation to be true. Many times while on a march, we would be caught in heavy rains. The dirt road would soon be worked into a loblolly of sticky yellow mud. We would take off our shoes and socks, tie them to the barrel of our muskets a little below the muzzle and just above the end of the stock, poise the piece on the hammer on either shoulder, stock uppermost, and roll up our breeches to the knees. Then, like Tam O'Shanter, we scalp it on through dub and mire, despising wind, and rain, and fire, singing John Brown's Body or whatever else came to mind. But rainy days in camp, especially those like we had at Benton Barracks, created feelings of gloom and dejection that have to be experienced to be fully understood. They were simply too wretched for any adequate description. One day, while strolling around the grounds sightseeing, I fell in with a soldier who said he belonged to the 14th Wisconsin Infantry. He was some years older than me, but he was sociable and seemed to be a sensible, intelligent fellow. He was full of talk about his regiment, said they were nearly all young men, big stalwart lumbermen from the pine woods of Wisconsin, and urged me to come around some evening when they were on dress parade and look at them. By this time, I had found out that almost every soldier would brag about his regiment, so I made allowances for what he said. But he excited my curiosity to see those Wisconsin boys, so one evening, when I was at liberty, I did go and view them on dress parade. I found that the soldier had not exaggerated. They were great, tall fellows, broad across the shoulders and chest, with big limbs. Altogether, they were, from a physical standpoint, the finest-looking soldiers I ever saw during my entire term of service. I speak now of this incident and of these men because later I may say something more about this 14th Wisconsin. While at Benton Barracks, we were given our regimental number, 61st, and thenceforth, the regiment was known and designated as the 61st Illinois Infantry. We also drew our guns. We were furnished with the Austrian rifle musket. It was of medium length, with a light brown walnut stock, and it was a wicked shooter. At that time, most of the Western troops were armed with foreign-made muskets imported from Europe. Many regiments had old Belgian muskets, a heavy, cumbersome piece, awkward and unsatisfactory in every way. We were glad to get the Austrians and were quite proud of them. We used these until June 1863, when we turned them in and drew in their place the Springfield rifle musket, model 1863. It was not as heavy as the Austrian, was neater looking, and a very efficient firearm. No further change was made, and we carried the Springfield thenceforward until we were mustered out. It was also at Benton Barracks that the mustering of the regiment into the service of the United States was completed. At that time, 10 companies constituted a regiment of infantry, but ours had only 9. We lacked Company K, which was not recruited and did not join the regiment until March 1864. Because of this, Colonel Fry, as we always called him, was commissioned only as a lieutenant colonel, which remained his rank throughout his time with us. Captain Simon P. Orr, of Company A, was commissioned as major. Due to our lack of one company, and the fact that by the time it did join us, the others had become much depleted in numbers, the regiment never had a full colonel until the summer of 1865, when it became entitled to one under circumstances that will be explained later. On March 25, we left Benton Barracks for the front. We marched through St. Louis and onto the steamboat that day, but for some reason I never knew, the boat did not leave the wharf until about dark the next evening. My company was quartered on the hurricane deck of the boat. Soon after the boat started down the river, an incident befell me that looks somewhat comical now, but at that time, it was a serious matter to me and one that troubled my conscience a great deal. I had piled my knapsack, with the blanket strapped on the outside, along with my other belongings, at the foot of the gun stack, which included my musket. Suddenly, I discovered, to my great consternation, that my blanket was gone. Yes, my lords and gentlemen, some false Scot had deliberately and feloniously appropriated my indispensable equipment for a night's repose. A long, raw March night was coming on, and the damp and chilly air was rising, like a fog, from the cold surface of the river. All signs, too, portended a rainy night. The thunder was muttering off in the southwest, intermittent flashes of lightning lit up the sky, and scattering drops of rain were even then beginning to patter on the hurricane deck and ripple the bosom of the stream. What should I do? I must have a blanket, that was certain. But all my life, the belief had been instilled in me that stealing was one of the most disgraceful of all crimes, and that a thief was a most odious and contemptible wretch. Moreover, one of the 10 Commandments pintedly declared, "Thou shalt not steal." But something had to be done, and quickly. At last, it occurred to me that, being a soldier and belonging for the time being to Uncle Sam, I was a species of government property, which it was my duty to protect at all hazards. That settled the question, and conscience and honesty withdrew. Without going into the demoralizing details, suffice it to say that I stole a blanket from some hapless victim belonging to another company, thus safeguarding the health and military efficiency of a chattel of the nation. How the other fellow got along, I don't know. I made no impertinent inquiries, and during the daytime, indefinitely thereafter, I kept that blanket in my knapsack, carefully concealed from prying eyes. But it will be recorded here that this was the only act of downright larceny that I committed during my entire term of service, except for the gobbling of a couple of onions, which maybe I'll mention later. Of course, I helped myself many times, while on the march or on picket, to roasting ears, sweet potatoes, apples, and the like, but that came under the head of legitimate foraging and was sanctioned by the military authorities. The night we left St. Louis, I had my first impressive object lesson showing the difference between the conditions of the commissioned officers and the enlisted men. I had spread my blanket at the base of the little structure called the Texas, on which the pilot house stands. All around the bottom of the Texas was a row of small window lights that commanded a view of the interior of the boat's cabin below. I only had to turn my head and look in and down to see what was happening. The officers were seated in cushioned chairs or sauntering around over the carpeted and brilliantly lit room while their supper was being prepared. Colored waiters, dressed in white uniforms, were bringing in the food. When all was ready, a gong was sounded, and the officers seated themselves at the table. And just look at the good things they had to eat. Fried ham and beefsteak, hot biscuits, butter, molasses, big boiled Irish potatoes steaming hot, fragrant coffee served with cream in cups and saucers, and some minor goodies in the shape of preserves and the like. And how savory those good things smelled. I was where I could get the full benefit of that. And there were the officers, in the warm, lighted cabin, seated at a table, with black waiters to serve them, feasting on that splendid fare. It was the very incarnation of bodily comfort and enjoyment. And when the officers should be ready to retire for the night, warm and cozy berths awaited them, where they would stretch their limbs on downy quilts and mattresses, utterly oblivious to the wet and chill on the outside. Then I turned my head and took in my surroundings. A black, cold night, cinders and soot drifting on us from the smokestacks, and a drizzling rain pattering down. My supper had consisted of hardtack and raw sowbelly, with river water for a beverage, of the vintage, say, of 1541. And to aggravate the situation generally, I was lying on a blanket which a military necessity had compelled me to steal. But I reflected that we couldn't all be officers, there had to be somebody to do the actual trigger pulling. And I further consoled myself with the thought that, while the officers had more privileges than the common soldiers, they likewise had more responsibilities and had to worry their brains about many things that didn't bother us a particle. So, I smothered all envious feelings as best I could, wrapped myself up good in my blanket, went to sleep, and all night long slept the unbroken, dreamless sleep of youth and health. The weather cleared up that night, and the next day was fine, and we all felt in better spirits. Our surroundings were new and strange, and we were thrilling with excitement and bright hopes for the future. The great majority of us were simple country boys who had so far passed our lives in a narrow circle in the backwoods. As for myself, before enlisting in the army, I had never been more than 50 miles from home, had not traveled any on a steamboat, and my few short railroad trips did not amount, in the aggregate, to more than about 75 miles, back and forth. But now, the contracted horizon of the Whip-Poor-Will ridges adjacent to the old home had suddenly expanded, and a great big wonderful world was unfolding before me. And there was the daring, heroic life on which we were entering. No individual boy expected that he would be killed or meet with any other adverse fate. Others might, and doubtless would, but he would come out safe and sound and return home at the end of a victorious war, a military hero, and as such, would be looked up to, admired, and revered all the rest of his life. At any rate, such were my thoughts, and I have no doubt whatever that 99 out of 100 of the other boys thought the same. On the afternoon of this day, March 27th, we arrived at Cairo, rounded in at the wharf, and remained for a short time. The town fronted on the Ohio River, which was high at the time, as was also the Mississippi. The appearance of Cairo was wretched. Levees had been constructed to protect it from high water, but nonetheless, the streets and the grounds generally were just a foul, stagnant swamp. Engines were at work pumping the surface water into the river through pipes in the levee, otherwise, I reckon everybody would have been drowned out. Charles Dickens saw this locality in the spring of 1842 while on a visit to America, and it figures in Martin Chuzzlewit under the name of Eden. I never read that book until after the close of the war but have several times since, and I will say that if the Eden of 1842 looked anything like the Cairo of 20 years later, his description was fully warranted. Our boat had hardly moored to the wharf before the word went around that some Confederate prisoners were on the transport to our right. We immediately rushed to that side to get our first look at the Secesh, as we then called them. It was only a small batch, about 100 or so. They were under guard, stationed on the after part of the lower deck, along the sides and stern of the boat. We ascertained that they were among the last installment of the Fort Donelson prisoners and were being shipped to a northern military prison. Naturally, we scanned them with great curiosity, and the boys soon began to joke and chaff them in a perfectly good-natured way. They took this silently, with no other manifestation than an occasional dry grin. Finally, a rather good-looking young fellow cocked his eyes toward us and, in a soft, drawling tone, called out, "You all will sing a different tune by next summer." Our boys responded to this with bursts of laughter and some derisive whoops, but later, we found out that the young Confederate soldier was a true prophet. Our halt at Cairo was brief. The boat soon cast off and proceeded up the Ohio to the mouth of the Tennessee, and from there up that river. Sometime the next day, we passed Fort Henry. We had read of its capture the previous month by the joint operations of our Army and Navy, and we were all curious to see this Confederate stronghold, where a mere handful of men had put up such a plucky fight. My ideas of forts at that time had all been drawn from pictures in books, which depicted old-time fortresses, and from descriptions in Scott's Marmion of ancient feudal castles like Tantallon Strong, and the like. And when we approached Fort Henry, I fully expected to see some grand, imposing structure with battled towers, donjon keep, portcullis, drawbridges, and whatnot. Perhaps some officer of high rank with a drawn sword would be strutting about on the ramparts and occasionally shouting at the top of his voice, "What, warder, ho!" or words to that effect. But to my utter amazement and disgust, when we steamed up opposite Fort Henry, I saw only a little squatty, insignificant-looking mud affair, without the slightest feature of any of the pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war. It had been built on the low-bottom ground near the bank of the Tennessee River. The stream was now high, and the adjacent land was largely covered with water, while the inside of the fort looked a good deal like a hog pen. I couldn't imagine how such a contemptible-looking thing had stood off our gunboats as long as it did. But I did not know then that just such works, with earthen walls, were the strongest and best defenses against modern artillery that could be constructed. In fact, what I didn't know about war at that stage of the proceedings was broad and comprehensive and covered the whole field. As we journeyed up the Tennessee, we began to notice queer-looking green bunches of something on the trees. As the forest had not yet put forth its foliage, we knew that growth could not be leaves, and we were puzzled to imagine what it could be. But we finally learned from some of the boat's crew that it was mistletoe. So far as I knew, none of the private soldiers had ever before seen that curious evergreen, and it was to us a strange curiosity. But we got well acquainted with it later. We arrived at Pittsburg Landing on the evening of March 31st, about sundown. On going into camp in our position upon the line, for the first time in our service, we dwelt in tents. We had what was called the Sibley tent, an affair of conical shape, rather large, and capable of accommodating about 12 men with their accoutrements. As a circumstance bearing on our ignorance of life in tents, I will say that we neglected to dig drainage ditches around them. On the very first night we slept in them, there came a heavy rain, and the next morning found us lying more or less in the water, our blankets and other stuff sopping wet. After that, whenever we pitched our tents, one of the first things we did was to dig around them a sufficient ditch with a lateral extension. I retain a vivid recollection of the kind of army cooking we had for the first few months in Tennessee. At Camp Carrollton in Benton Barracks, we had company cooks who prepared the food for the entire company. They were merely enlisted men, detailed for that purpose, and while their cooking was nothing to brag about, it was vastly superior to what now ensued. We divided up into messes of 4, 8, or 12 men, or thereabouts, to the mess, and generally took turns in the culinary line. Very few of us knew anything whatsoever about cooking, and our exploits in that regard would have been comical if the effects had not been so harmful. Flour was issued to us after our arrival at Pittsburg Landing, but we had no utensils in which we could cook biscuits or loaves. So we would make a batter out of flour, water, grease, and salt, and cook it in a mess pan, the product being the Army flapjack. It was invariably as tough as a mule's ear, about as heavy as lead, and very indigestible. Later, we learned to construct ovens of wood, daubed with mud, or of stone, and in them, over time, we acquired the knack of baking good bread. But with us in the West, the hardtack was generally our standard bread diet, and nothing could beat it. For some time, our cooking of Yankee beans, as we called them, was simply atrocious. As you know, beans should be cooked until they are thoroughly done, otherwise, they are decidedly harmful. Well, we would not cook them much more than halfway, the result being a sloppy, slimy mess, its looks alone being well-nigh sufficient to extinguish one's appetite. And as for the rice, the horrible messes we made of that defy description. One consequence for me was that I contracted such an aversion to rice that, for many years afterward, while in civil life, I just couldn't eat it in any form, no matter how temptingly it was prepared. Owing to improperly cooked food, change of climate and water, and neglect of proper sanitation measures in the camps, camp diarrhea became epidemic at Pittsburg Landing, especially among the green regiments like ours. For about 6 weeks, everybody suffered more or less, the difference being only in degree. The fact is, the condition of the troops in that quarter during the prevalence of that disorder was so bad and repulsive that any detailed description thereof will be passed over. I never saw the like before, and I never have seen it since. I always thought that one thing which aggravated this trouble was the inordinate quantity of sugar some of the men would consume. They would not only use it to excess in their coffee and rice but would frequently eat it raw by the handful. I happen to think, right now, of an incident that illustrates the unnatural appetite some of the men had for sugar. It occurred in camp one rainy day during the siege of Corinth. Jake Hill, of my company, had covered the top of a big army hardtack with sugar in a cone-like form, piling it on as long as the tack would hold a grain. Then he seated himself on his knapsack and proceeded to gnaw away at his feast by a system of regular approaches. He was even then suffering from the epidemic before mentioned and was so weak he could hardly walk. Someone said to him, "Jake, that sugar ain't good for you in your condition." He looked up with an aggrieved air and responded in a tone of cruelly injured innocence, "Haven't I the right to eat my raa tie-in?" Strange to say, Jake got well and served throughout the war. He was a good soldier, too. For my part, I quit using sugar in any form early in my army service, except a little, occasionally, with stewed fruit or berries, and didn't resume its general use until some years after my discharge from the army. As a consequence of the conditions at Pittsburg Landing that have been alluded to, men died by the score like rotten sheep. A great many more were discharged for disability and thereby were lost to the service. It is true that some of these discharged men, especially the younger ones, subsequently re-enlisted and made good soldiers. But this loss to the Union armies in Tennessee in the spring of 1862 from disease undoubtedly surpassed the casualties of a great battle. Unlike a battle, however, there was no resulting compensation whatsoever. That concludes the second part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.